At 30,000 feet above the Pacific, the sky should have been empty. Instead, it was alive with death. 14 Japanese fighters were climbing straight toward a single American bomb. A silver giant so large it looked untouchable, and so slow it looked doomed. The crew of the B-29 didn't know yet that before this mission ended, 2 enemy planes would deliberately ram into their aircraft, their wings slicing metal, their propellers tearing flesh and steel apart. They didn't know that their bomber would be left bleeding fuel, its tail shredded, its gunners wounded, and its survival reduced to minutes. And they didn't know that this same damaged aircraft, already half destroyed, would still shoot down 14 enemy fighters and limp back from hell itself. This is not just a story of firepower. This is a story of endurance, fear, sacrifice, and the terrifying moment when human beings decide that they will not fall, no matter how many enemies rise to stop them. By 1945, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress had become the most feared aircraft in the world. It flew higher than most fighters could reach. It carried bombs capable of leveling cities. And it represented something Japan could no longer stop. American air dominance. Japanese radar stations tracked them constantly. Civilians looked up in terror. Pilots clenched their teeth. Because when a B-29 appeared overhead, it meant destruction was already on the way. On this mission, the target was deep inside Japan, a heavily defended industrial zone critical to aircraft production. The bomber formation was thin. Fuel loads were heavy, and the weather was clear enough for interceptors to see everything. One B-29, flying slightly behind the formation due to a minor engine issue, became the obvious target. Its crew consisted of 11 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, and gunners stationed across the aircraft like sentries in a floating fortress. They had trained for flak. They had trained for fighters. What they had not trained for was deliberate suicide attacks at altitude. The first Japanese fighters appeared as black specks against the sun. Then they multiplied. Zeros, Ki-43s, Ki-84s, veteran pilots and desperate rookies mixed together, climbing with everything their engines could give. The tail gunner was the first to open fire. Tracer rounds streaked backward, bright red lines slicing the sky. One fighter exploded instantly, fuel tank igniting, wings snapping off like paper. Then another. The B-29's gunners worked in coordination, calling targets, adjusting lead, firing in controlled bursts. Within minutes, 6 enemy fighters were already down. But the Japanese pilots kept coming. They flew through fire, through debris, through the falling bodies of their own comrades, because they had been given a different order. The 7th attacker did not fire. He didn't break away. He didn't pull up. Instead, he aimed directly at the bomber's tail. The tail gunner screamed a warning, but there was no time. The fighter smashed into the B-29's rear section. Metal screamed. The tail assembly shuddered violently as parts of the enemy. Aircraft were ripped apart and scattered across the sky. The gunner was thrown against his harness. The tail section depressurized. Control cables snapped. The Japanese pilot died instantly. The American bomber stayed airborne. Smoke poured from the rear, and alarms screamed through the cockpit. Before the crew could recover, another fighter followed the same path. This time it struck the wing root. The impact tore open a fuel line. Flames burst outward, licking along the wing. The engineer shouted, fuel pressure readings dropping fast. The pilot fought the controls, hands shaking, jaw clenched. They were still over enemy territory. They were still surrounded. And the worst was not over. The air becomes a graveyard. Now the B-29 was wounded, and every enemy pilot could see it. The remaining Japanese fighters attacked in waves. Head-on passes, vertical dives, climbing spirals. The nose gunner fired continuously, barrel glowing red. One enemy plane lost its cockpit entirely. Pilot erased in a blink. Another clipped a wing and spiraled downward. Smoke trailing like a funeral ribbon. The top turret jammed briefly, then cleared just in time to tear apart a fighter coming straight for the cockpit. The radio operator was wounded by shrapnel. Blood soaked into the floor. The tail gunner, half-deaf and bleeding, kept firing manually after losing hydraulic assist. By the time the last attacker broke away, 14 Japanese fighters had been destroyed. The sky behind the B-29 was filled with smoke, fire, and falling metal. Silence followed. Part 5, the flight home. But surviving the fight was only the beginning. The bomber was barely controllable. Fuel was leaking. 2 engines were damaged. The pressurization system was gone. At high altitude, the cold was brutal. The crew wore oxygen masks for hours. faces numb, fingers stiff. Every vibration felt like the aircraft might tear itself apart. Enemy radar could still detect them. More fighters could come at any moment, but none did. Perhaps they believed the bomber was already dead. Hours later, the coastline appeared, friendly waters. When the B-29 finally landed, ground crews stared in disbelief. The aircraft was shredded. Holes covered its fuselage. Entire sections were patched together by luck alone. It should not have made it back. Yet every surviving crew member walked off the plane. This battle became legendary, not because of numbers, but because of what it revealed. The desperation of Japan's air defense, the terrifying reality of ramming attacks, and the brutal resilience of crews flying missions they knew might be one way. For the men inside that B-29, victory did not feel heroic. It felt heavy. They remembered the moment those fighters chose death. They remembered the sound of impact. They remembered wondering if the next second would be their last. After the engines finally shut down, the silence felt unreal. No gunfire, no alarms, no wind screaming past torn metal. Just men standing on a runway, staring at the aircraft that had carried them through death. Ground crews counted the holes slowly, not because they had to, but because they couldn't believe how many there were. More than 300 bullet impacts. Structural damage that should have snapped the wings. A tail section that no longer met design standards or logic. One mechanic later said, "This plane didn't land. It refused to crash." Inside the bomber, the smell of cordite fuel and blood still hung in the air. Oxygen masks lay discarded. Spent shell casings rolled underfoot. The wounded were treated quietly. No one spoke much, because survival brings relief. But it also brings questions that never leave. Why us? Why did we make it back when others didn't? That night the crew slept fully dressed. Some never slept at all. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw fighters rising out of the sun. They felt the impact again. They heard metal tearing. The war continued the next morning. Another mission, another target. But for these men, something had changed forever. They had seen what desperation looks like at 30,000 feet, when a human being chooses to become a weapon. When the sky decides, history will list this mission as numbers. 14 fighters destroyed, 2 ramming attacks, 1 B-29 returned. But numbers don't remember fear. They don't feel the moment when a pilot realizes there is no maneuver left, only faith in the men beside him. They don't hear the gunner whisper, "Hold together, just a little longer." They don't understand what it means to watch another human being fly directly into you, knowing neither of you may survive the impact. That B-29 did not win because it was invincible. It won because the men inside it refused to quit, even when the sky itself turned hostile. And long after the war ended, long after the aircraft was scrapped or preserved, that moment still existed, frozen somewhere above the Pacific. A place where courage met desperation, where steel met flesh, where survival became an act of rebellion. Because sometimes in war, the most powerful weapon is not a bomb, not a gun, not even a fortress in the sky. It is the decision to keep flying when everything else tells you to fall.